today we're talking about the topic of submission as a spiritual discipline. And there's a lot of ways this has been misused in the church, and but I think there is a tremendous witness to be gained by the people of God adequately and accurately living out the discipline of submission. It is an outward display of an inward humility, and it's simply our response to what God has done for us. It's an attitude that is displayed by God is first, others are second, I am third attitude. And I know you've seen the I am second campaign, and I think they're just missing it just a little bit because, again, I think this is what God calls us to live out. God is number one in our lives, and we're to live our lives for those around us. And I am third. You shall have no other gods before me. Submit to one another. Love one another as you love yourself, or some of those passages we'll dive into a little bit deeper. It's this idea of its principle over right. There are places where we as believers find themselves where we have rights that we must relinquish in order to live out humility for those around us. For example, Romans 14 talks about you have these rights, but you need to give them up for the weaker brothers and sisters around you. I think submission is one of those disciplines that in Western civilization, especially in America, it's a difficult one because it feels like you're being a sucker, if you will. Especially as we find ourselves in a more global world with all sorts of different belief systems. It's a more pluralistic society we find ourselves in. And as I think about Jesus and the Samaritan woman, where he engages with her instead of chastising her, I find that to be a very beautiful exercise of kind of Jesus submitting himself to this woman who is in just really not a great place, not a great season in life. And he submits himself to her and ministers to her. You know, why should we talk about submission? Kinnaman, in his book Unchristian from several years back, was asking the question, what is Christianity's reputation out there? What do people really think about Christianity? And there were common negative perceptions about present-day Christianity. For example, 87% they found of people they polled said Christians are judgmental. And 85% of them said, you know what, Christians are hypocritical as well. They're old-fashioned, and they're far too involved in politics. And just let that sink in. Saying this is what people think about Christians. Not very submissive, if you would. Well, they looked at what are some of the most favorable perceptions, and it says Christianity teaches the same ideas as other religions. And people said, well, Christianity has some good values and principles, and Christians are friendly, and Christianity is a faith they respect, but excuse me, the question I have is, are we distinct? You know, as you go back to these favorable perceptions, there's not a whole lot of distinctiveness that's coming through in who we are and how we're portraying ourselves. And Jesus, if you remember, calls us to be salt and light, to be something that's different. He said the one thing, more than anything, in this survey that they found was that they said Christians are anti-homosexual. Now, I don't know where you stand on this topic, but 91% of young non-Christians said, you know, when I think of a Christian, I think of them being anti-gay. And 80% of young churchgoers says this is a phrase that describes Christianity. Now, for me, I think this doesn't strike me as a public relations image that communicates submission. I see this as this snapshot of judgmental, hypocritical, anti-gay, has the same beliefs. We're not different and we're not unique. And I think this is one of those areas where the discipline of submission can come in handy. Genesis 3, the original sin that we find humanity fall prey to, is a perfect example of humanity's refusal to submit. And as a result, we all have to deal with sin. We're reminded in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, where God says, I am the one who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in any form, in anything in heaven or on earth beneath and the waters below. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. So God here in these commands are saying, me alone are what you submit to. And then Jesus talks about the submission that he has. In his prayer to his Father at the end, he says, I have brought you glory on your earth by completing the work you gave me to do. I have revealed you to those who you gave me out of the world. For I gave them the words you gave me, and they accepted them. And they knew with certainty that I came from you, and they believed that you sent me. All I have is yours, and all you have is mine. So a beautiful picture in John 17 of Jesus saying, Father, I have been submissive to you. Everything I have came from you. Everything I've done is because of you. Jesus presents a perfect snapshot of submission. Well, submission is displayed in several ways that we can live it out. One is in our own self-denial. Jesus says, come after me, deny yourself, pick up your cross, follow me. He describes this individual form of submission to the Godhead, and the denial of oneself is foundational to our own individual relationship with God. If I can't deny myself before God, my relationship with the Godhead is flawed at best. Since idolatry is the original sin, the failure to submit our own relationship to God completely overlooks this whole creator-creation relationship. And this isn't slavery to an unknown God. No, rather it's a willing submission to a kind and generous and benevolent deity. I like to use the snapshot or the metaphor of yielding. A lot of times when we think of submission, we think of this slavery instead of this idea of yield. You have the right when you're driving down the road to just kind of plow through a yield sign and do whatever you want with your relationship in God. But that will leave you on your own and without direction. We have the right to do whatever we want without any care for God's direction. We can do whatever we want. But that will leave us without a moral compass as well. Yet if we choose to yield to God, we will have the necessary direction in order to navigate life well. We see submission displayed in the parental-child relationship. It says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. And I find this very interesting. So if you go back to Exodus chapter 5, you see the promise is so that you may live long, and that it may go well with you in the land, and the Lord your God is giving you. And so, think about the options that are available to us if we don't want to yield to our mother's or our father's desires, right? We will have conflict. Perhaps we'll learn lessons the hard way. where we're like, Mom says this, I'm going to do this, and you learn it the hard way. Or you can just say, Mom says this, I'm going to say, I don't believe it. You learn it the hard way, and you have to end up eating your words. Or sometimes, every once in a while, Mom says this, you're going to try it anyways. And every once in a while, you find out you're right and your parents are wrong. But most importantly, what I'd like to talk about is this idea of submission in communal and marital relationships. When you look at Ephesians 5:21 through 33, we have traditionally taught that this has been a text in Stone Campbell churches that women must submit to males. And this is played out in all different forms, whether it's the home or public worship or the classroom and Bible classes. There's all sorts of ways that we live out this passage. But the thing I find very interesting is that Ephesians 5:21 is really the framing verse, and a lot of English texts separate 5:21 from the rest of the passages when it starts to talk about husbands and wives and the like. But 5:21 is the most important verse. It says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so there's this mutual submission. I am to submit to my wife in the same way my wife is to submit to me. And sometimes we try to dice those two descriptions of women, wives and husbands. But when you look at the husband's call, he says, husbands, submit to your wife as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? He gave himself up for her. I don't say that's any different than what the wives are called to do. You see, mutual submission is key to this healthy community. And the basis of this is unearned honor. We are to submit to one another around us, not because it's earned, because they are already God's creation. Healthy marital relationships are framed also in mutual submission. This isn't a hierarchy that's being described. No, you've heard it. You have the right to do whatever you want in your relationships. However, submission is generally the most healthy option for both genders. Then let's look at forgiveness as a form of submission. It says, Jesus says, forgive our sins when he's teaching us in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And another way perhaps of translating this is forgive us our sins in the same way we forgive those who sin against us. What if we offered forgiveness to those who are waiting, we are waiting for to ask us for it? In other words, I've thought of times in my life, or I've seen in other people's lives where I said, I'll give them forgiveness, but they have to ask for it first. And I go back to Jesus' words, forgive our sins in the same ways we forgive those who sin against us. And I wonder, do I want Jesus to forgive my sins in the same way I forgive those around me? If I do, I need to realize that perhaps I should offer forgiveness to those before they even ask for it. Maybe there's times where I can go up to, let's say, Jane, who's wronged me, and say, Jane, you may not realize you've wronged me, but I forgive you. Can you imagine how transforming that could be? Imagine what would change if we began to offer forgiveness proactively. Then we have this idea of submission being displayed through our own civic responsibility. Everyone's to submit themselves to the governing authorities, because there's no authority except for those which God has established by God. And perhaps this might change some of the political rhetoric in our churches, in our faith communities. The text states that God ordains those in governing authority, and the believer is called to follow them. I mean, without the only stipulation for rulers who hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Those in authority must do so without terror. Not, in other words, they must use their power justly. And as I look around the political landscape, especially within churches, I feel like sometimes we don't just follow them submissively in the way perhaps that God's calling us to in this passage. I mean, what kind of attitude do we possess as Christians to those around us? Whether police, administrators, teachers, moms, congressmen, presidents, etc. We don't present perhaps the best witness there. And why is this important? Because George Barnard, Josh McDowell, and other research survey people, survey after survey, shows almost no discernible difference between Christians and non-Christians. This includes cheating on tests, marital infidelity, divorce, ethics violations, and so on. And so I just wonder kind of what kind of message we present to those around us. I mean, submission means we need to have a healthy respect, also a healthy humility, but also a sacrifice at times. And this is, I think, where this discipline gets very difficult. I mean, there's a sense in every once in a while that living out a life of submission, that sacrifice becomes necessary. And there's this sense that perhaps we need to feel as if we're doormats from time to time. However, I think a better way of looking at this, instead of thinking I'm a doormat, where Foster talks about Yoder's idea of revolutionary subordination, where that there is tremendous power that is inherent through submission. And when we count others better than ourselves. And when Jesus was reviled, he did not revile others in return. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn to them the other cheek. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of power that goes who acts like this. Passages like Colossians 3 that talks about the submission of children to parents and slaves to masters, and Ephesians 5 that talk about wives and children, are revolutionary really in their teaching, Yoder says, because what they're doing is they're giving people rights now who had not been afforded any choice or rights beforehand. And also, husbands and the fathers and the masters are now given imperatives to love their wives and treat their children or slaves fairly in order what? To display self-denial. I mean, this is a dramatic change in the shift in the cultural ethos of their time. I mean, but, however, submission must end when it becomes destructive. We see, for example, in the area of civic responsibility, we must obey God rather than men in those times where the earthly leaders were taking things too far. And if there's any form of abuse, verbal, physical, emotional, spiritual, those are reasons to end those relationships because they violate the higher virtue of love one another. I mean, quite simply, revolutionary subordination commands us to live in submission to human authority until it becomes destructive. So today, your challenge with submission is there'll be a short video that I want you to watch, and then a journal exercise that I'll give you with that afterwards. But think about those specific areas, your civic responsibilities and your relational relationships, and where you might become more submissive. I'm interested in your journal entries about this as well, and to see what you have to say about some of these specific areas.